Back in the summer of 1978, in a sleepy town just outside of Charleston, South Carolina, lived a woman named Grace Holloway. She was 32, a school teacher with a gentle manner and a voice that always seemed just above a whisper. People knew her around town, not because she was loud or social, but because she wore a fresh rose in her hair every single day. Always the same place, tucked just behind her ear. It didn't matter the weather or the day. Grocery shopping? Rose. Church service? Rose. Just walking to the mailbox in her robe and slippers? Still a rose. Folks used to joke she must own a flower shop, or had a secret admirer sending them. But over time, the curiosity faded into quiet speculation. No one really knew why she wore them, and Grace never offered the reason. She lived in a small white cottage with ivy creeping up its wooden siding and a porch swing that groaned under the weight of time. No husband, no children, no visible family. Just Grace, a cat named Sullivan, and the faint scent of rose petals that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Then came the Warrens. Tom and Rebecca Warren moved in next door that fall. Tom was in the Air Force, recently transferred to a nearby base. Rebecca, barely 25, had a laugh that carried across the yard and a heart big enough for everyone. She brought cookies on their first week, knocked on every door on the block, and made it her mission to befriend the mysterious woman with the flower in her hair. At first, Grace was polite but distant. She smiled, offered tea, asked about Tom's service. But Rebecca had a gentle persistence about her. She didn't push, just kept showing up, just kept being kind. And eventually, Grace softened. They began having tea on Grace's porch in the late afternoons. Grace would sit with her back straight and her hands neatly folded in her lap. Rebecca, by contrast, would kick off her shoes and talk about everything. Her dreams, her fears, her thoughts about growing old. She'd often ask Grace questions about her past, but Grace would dodge them gently, redirecting the conversation like someone changing the station on an old radio. One day, though, curiosity got the better of Rebecca. "Grace," she asked, "do you mind if I ask about the rose? You always wear one, and I guess I've always wondered why." Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached up and touched the bloom behind her ear, almost as if checking it was still there. After a long silence, she said, "It's for someone I used to love. A long time ago." Rebecca didn't push, but the next evening Grace came over with a box. It was wooden, worn at the corners, and tied with a red ribbon that had long since faded to a dusty pink. She placed it on the table between them and said, "If you want to know, read these. But please, bring them back tomorrow." Inside were letters, maybe 50 or 60, written in neat cursive on aged yellowing paper. The earliest was dated July 1965. The letters told a love story. That summer, Grace had attended a summer literature course at a university in Vermont. There, she met Daniel Lawson, not a student, but the cousin of one. He was tall, soft-spoken, and had a love of poetry that matched her own. They read sonnets under trees, walked along the lake, and kissed behind the library after dark. Grace had never believed in love at first sight, but with Daniel, she did. They spent just 7 weeks together, but it was enough. When the course ended, Daniel told her he was enlisting. The draft had come, and he didn't want to wait. He promised to write, and he did. Beautiful, aching letters full of poetry, longing, and dreams. Grace sent him letters back, always with a rose pressed inside. Daniel began calling her his Rose Girl. His letters from basic training were hopeful, almost boyish. From overseas, they grew darker. He described the jungles, the mud, the fear, the friends he'd lost, the nightmares. But always he ended with love. Always he asked her to wait. Then in November 1968, the letter stopped. No goodbye, no final words. Grace waited. At first she thought it was a delay, then a mistake. Weeks passed, then months. She wrote more letters, all returned unopened. She contacted the Red Cross, the Army, the VA. All they could tell her was that Daniel was missing in action after a mission in Quang Tri province. There was no body, no confirmation, just silence. Grace was 22 then. Friends tried to comfort her. A man from her church offered to take her out. She tried once, a movie and a polite dinner, but she couldn't bring herself to feel anything. Her heart was still somewhere in the jungle. Every year, on the anniversary of Daniel's last letter, she bought a rose, pressed it into a book, and wrote him a new letter. Even though she had no address to send it to, she kept them all in the same wooden box. Rebecca returned the letters the next day, eyes red. "I think he really loved you," she whispered. Grace smiled sadly. "I know." Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, Tom came through the door holding a newspaper. "You need to see this," he said, handing it to Rebecca. It was a small article in the local section. A man had shown up at the VA hospital downtown. He said he'd been in Vietnam, said he'd been injured in an explosion in 1968 and had no memory of who he was. For years, he'd lived in and out of long-term care under a different name, but recently flashes had returned, a woman, a name, and the smell of roses. Rebecca and Tom drove Grace to the hospital. They found him by a window, looking out at a small rose bush in the courtyard. When Grace stepped into the room, the man turned. For a moment, nothing. Then he said softly, "You're real." He didn't remember everything. Some years were still blank. But he remembered her, the poetry, the letters, the roses. It was Daniel. Misidentified after the explosion, he'd spent over a decade as someone else, buried in bureaucracy and forgotten records. But something in him, something deeper than memory, had held on to Grace. They didn't cry or shout or cling. They just sat there for hours, hand in hand, not saying much at all. Like no time had passed. 6 months later, they were married in a simple backyard ceremony. No tuxedos, no music. Just friends, neighbors, and roses, lots of roses. They spent the next 25 years together. Grace returned to teaching. Daniel volunteered at the VA. Every year on November 12th, the day he disappeared, they wrote letters to each other and placed them in the box. In 2003, Daniel passed away in his sleep. Grace held his hand until the end. She still wore a rose every day after that, but now everyone knew why. Thank you for listening. Until the next heartbeat in a story. Subscribe and stay for more love in every word.